20 years ago this summer, a tragedy occurred that has often been described as the worst episode of mass murder in Europe since the Second World War. The Srebrenica massacre claimed the lives of more than 8,000 Bosnian Muslim boys and men and saw an estimated hundreds of Bosnian Muslim women raped and assaulted. Srebrenica also serves in the background of author Ausma Khan's first novel. It's called The Unquiet Dead, and we welcome her back to TVO. I say back to TVO even though you've never been here before, but you've been on this program before via satellite.
That's right.
So it's nice to see you again.
Thank you.
You've got a Ph.D. in international human rights law, specialization in military intervention and war crimes in the Balkans, and you've written a novel.
Yes.
So why'd you want to write a murder mystery set in Toronto as a novel?
I think it was a natural progression for me from my academic work. I'd been doing graduate work on the Bosnian War for about 10 years. And the stories that I came across in refugee testimony, survivor testimony, war crimes testimony, they had always been in my head. And I had expressed it in my academic writing, but I felt that there was a lot more of a story to tell. And I've been writing all my life, and I've always had this desire to write fiction, and I'm a great fan of mystery fiction. So I thought here would be a perfect opportunity to bring all these things together and explore the subject that I was so interested in, and have that story reach probably a much broader audience this way.
Publisher ever say to you, this story is harrowing enough for real? Why do you want to do a novelization of it?
No, the publisher never said that. I think they found it something very unique and different and intriguing. And after the book came out, I had a lot of people come up to me and say, well, we knew that war took place, but we really didn't know what it was like, and we didn't know what people had experienced during the war. So I think that found a space that people hadn't seen before. Let's
get into this. In your book, your fictional detective protagonists are part of something called the Community Policing Section. What is that?
So the community policing section is something that I invented for my book, but I actually got the idea from some research I had done about the RCMP, where they have a community policing division out in British Columbia. And what they did was outreach into different ethnic communities to see what their law enforcement needs were and to sort of make them more sensitive to law enforcement concerns. And that sparked this idea that maybe that's something we need in a city as diverse and multicultural as Toronto, is investigators who are in these different communities, who are sensitive to their particular law enforcement concerns and their needs, and who can face this delicate tension of being from within these communities, but also having to work as law enforcement officers. Inventing it for Toronto also gave me the latitude to do whatever I wanted in terms of police procedure, not have to follow the actual existing police guidelines so closely. And it allowed me to place a second-generation Canadian Muslim detective into the setting and to liaise with the Muslim community.
So we don't have this, but you think we need this. Have you told anybody about this?
No, I haven't, but I know that all police forces, of course, have sensitivity training. But I think in mystery fiction in particular, you don't often see, or thriller fiction, for example, you rarely see a Muslim character who is speaking from the inside rather than being spoken for or spoken about.
We don't want to give away too much of the plot here, but let's just say somebody's fallen off the Scarborough Bluffs to their death, and your detectives are in there and they have to investigate. You want to give us, again, don't spoil the ending, but you want to give us a sense about what they find?
Yes, absolutely. So these two detectives, they're Canadian detectives, and the team is led by Isa Khatak and his partner, Sergeant Rachel Getty. And they're given a call by the chief war crimes historian at the Department of Justice, and they're asked to look into the fall of a man named Christopher Drayton. He's fallen from the Scarborough Bluffs. So on the surface, it doesn't seem like a minority-sensitive situation that they can bring their special expertise to. But as they dig into his past and start uncovering some of the clues about who he was, it seems that he may have been a fugitive, a Bosnian Serb war criminal who was living under an assumed identity in Canada. And as they start to dig into his history and the fact that he may have had ties to the Srebrenica massacre in 1995, they now must face this question of whether perhaps a victim of that war or a victim who's connected to him may have been responsible, and his death may not have been a fall or a suicide, but might actually have been a murder.
Anybody who writes fiction has to be prepared for this question, so here it comes. I mean, have you just changed the names to protect the innocent, and this is a real story?
I have relied very heavily on real events that took place during this war, but there's no single individual that I have represented directly. But certainly I was inspired by the stories of refugees, by stories in the news about indicted war criminals. And all of that has come into this book and formed the backstory of it.
Okay. Ausma, let's go back to 20 years ago. And we're going to start, just look over my shoulder at the monitor. If we can bring these up, Sheldon. Here's some maps of the part of the world that we're going to be talking about. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, as it was then called back in January of 1991. From north to south, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia. And let's flip over to the next map, and you can see how things have changed. Now it's called the former Yugoslavia. Many of these places, which were constituent republics within one country, are now countries of their own. There's Kosovo in the south as well, which has been recognized as an independent place by some countries in this world. And Macedonia is now called the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. This is how the world has changed over that period of time. I want you to take us back because, again, for a lot of people who, it's a while ago and we have to relearn the lessons of history all the time. Josip Broz Tito is you want to call him the dictator, or what do you want to call him?
Sure, the dictator is as good a term as any.
The dictator of Yugoslavia. He manages to keep control of this one country while he's alive, and then he dies. What happens next?
So what happens next is, some people call it wars of secession from Yugoslavia, but eventually these republics are unable to negotiate a new confederal structure and begin to make their moves for independence. First Slovenia, then Croatia in 1991, and then Bosnia. So what happens is, once Slovenia and Croatia are gone, there is no longer a Yugoslavia. It's essentially the great Serb bloc of Serbia and Montenegro, and Bosnia also wants to make its move for independence because one of the things that it's important to remember is that Bosnia, since the Middle Ages, has always had a distinct political and geographic identity, and a very distinct and unique cultural flavor of a multi-ethnic existence.
It was everybody, right? Everybody mixed up together.
That's right, and that's part of its historical record that people often forget. So it was never part of Serbia and Montenegro. It did not wish to be absorbed into Serbia.
Actually, we got some numbers on this, as long as we're on the topic. Sheldon, bring this up if you would. On top of page 4. Yes, Bosnia's ethnic groups, of a population of 4 million, the Bosniak group, or Bosnian Muslim group, 44%, but Serbs made up almost a third, and Croats made up 17%, and then people who self-identified as Yugoslav, I'm not sure what that would be. What is that?
Could be everything else.
Could be everything under the sun, right.
Ruthenians, Jews,
right.
People who are intermarried. For example, in Bosnia, a quarter of marriages cut across these ethnic lines.
Right, lots of intermarriage. Now, those statistics are from 25 years ago. Okay, so these sort of forces of independence, now that Tito is dead, are taking hold. How did all of these different groups within Bosnia react to the newfound situation?
So the departure of Slovenia and Croatia was not welcomed by Serbia, and 2 small, shorter wars were prosecuted in both those states before war came to Bosnia. There was a 6-month war in Croatia with a war count of some 10,000 dead.
Between whom and whom? Between
Serbia and Croatia, where Serbs were seizing Croatian territory. A quarter of Croatian territory in the cities of Dubrovnik and Vukovar suffered terrible destruction. That was before war came to Bosnia. Slovenia was let go without too much difficulty. A 10-day war took place there. But the war in Bosnia was long and protracted. It began with the Bosnian movement for independence. So Croatia and Slovenia had moved very quickly and without much concern for international opinion. But the Republic of Bosnia had followed the formulations laid down by the international community for recognition, moved slowly and precisely, held a referendum, a popular referendum, in which 68% of the population voted in favor of this independence, and was recognized and admitted as a member state of the United Nations. And immediately after that began the assault on Bosnia with the siege of Sarajevo.
Let's just understand something here. You told us that Slovenia in the north, basically the Yugoslav/Serbian forces let them go, but not Bosnia. Bosnia, there was a war there. Why the difference?
I think because, for one thing, it was part of the Greater Serbia project, this idea to amalgamate Serb populations within a Greater Serbia, and there was a significant Bosnian Serb population intermixed in Bosnia. And of course, later in the war, the Croatian forces also got involved and also thought about taking the Greater Croatia project further and annexing territory for themselves.
They both wanted to carve it up, didn't they?
So in 1993, it was a desperate situation for the people of Bosnia. But I think one of the things that we have to remember about that referendum is what was it for? It was for a constitutional democracy where all the citizens of Bosnia would have equal protection of and equal status under the law, competing with this other vision of a Serb-dominated state where other groups in the state couldn't be sure what their status would be. And then, as we can see in the war that lasted from 1992 to 1995, those groups were right to be afraid. about what their status would be under the Greater Serbia project, because essentially those lands were cleansed of their non-Serb inhabitants.
I'll put this on the record. I know you're going to disagree with it, but I'll put it out there for you to react to anyway. The Serb position was, we are the last bulwark against a Muslim tide that wants to take over all of Europe. And if the world doesn't come and help us now, ... Serbs would say the ... has been in plentiful evidence ever since then. You would say what to that?
I would say that that rhetoric is much more popular and would be much more persuasive now than it was then. It was used at the time as well, but I think it flies in the face of the lived realities of the Bosnian people, who didn't identify in these strict ethnic categories, who very much saw themselves as one people. And if you look at when the siege of Sarajevo began, you'll see that the figures have been put somewhere between 30 and 80,000, but somewhere in that range, 30 to 80,000 Bosnian Serbs resisted the siege of Sarajevo, resisted this purified vision of their nation, resisted a rewriting of their history. The commanders of the army of Bosnia and Herzegovina were a Bosnian Serb, a Bosnian Croat. The general who defended Sarajevo during siege was a Bosnian Serb. The major newspaper there, Oslobođenje, was a multi-ethnic mix, all who had written in favor of the referendum for independence. So the idea that Muslims didn't belong or didn't have a history there or were these foreign Turk invaders or occupiers, that was a revision of history. And of course, the Bosnian Muslim population was actually very secular. In the intervening years, now that people have been forced into their ethnic and religious categories, identity has changed in Bosnia. It's a very different story now, but I think it simply doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
When I was there in the early 90s, I heard somebody describe it as, this is a war among Bosnian Muslims who don't go to mosque, Croatian Catholics who don't go to church, and Eastern Orthodox Serbs who don't go to their church either. It was a religious war among religious groups that didn't actually practice their religions.
That's right.
Is there some truth to that?
I think there is some truth to that, but even more so, it was an ultranationalist program.
Yeah. Okay, let's bring up the next map then, Sheldon. We're now at the bottom of page 4, Bosnia and Herzegovina. We just talked about Sarajevo. Let's look to the east now, right near the border with Serbia. There's Srebrenica. And 20 years ago this summer, Srebrenica, if you were alive, you remember it well, was the focus of a great deal of international attention because of atrocities that took place there 20 years ago. What happened?
In 1995, Srebrenica, which was a United Nations designated safe area, one of 3 on the eastern border, it was overrun by the Bosnian Serb army in a matter of days. Srebrenica, Tuzla, and Dutchbat had all been designated as safe areas, which meant that they were under United Nations protection, or were meant to be, as much as such protection could exist when you have a peacekeeping force planted in the middle of an army. And these safe areas were choked off. They were isolated from the Bosnian command. They were impossible to defend. There were not adequate forces in there to defend. So these civilian populations for this 3-year period had been under siege. They're essentially being shelled and starved every day. And the situation in Srebrenica in 1995 was very dire. These enclaves in the Eastern Bloc also represented an impediment to proposed peace plans, where this territory could be given over to Bosnian Serb forces were it not for their significant Muslim populations. So in July of 1995, the Bosnian Serb army on July 6th began its push from the south into the Srebrenica enclave. And it began by shelling the Dutch observation post. So the peacekeeping forces in the battalion were the Dutch battalion known as Dutchbat.
How did they do?
Terribly. By any accounting, the record on Dutchbat in Srebrenica is appalling. But at that moment and at that time, they did report up their chain of command that we are under siege, our observation posts are being attacked, and we request close air support. And the Dutch battalion, in fact, in that period of time, had made 6 requests for close air support to prevent the Serb advance into Srebrenica. None of those requests were met. When finally permission was granted, by that time the NATO planes had been in the air for hours and had to turn back and refuel. So it was a complete tragedy of errors what took place in Srebrenica. Within 5 days, the Bosnian Serb army had conquered the entire enclave, and the population of not just the town but the surrounding enclave had taken refuge at the UN base in Potocari.
In fact, I think the Dutchbat, is that what you call it?
Yes, Dutchbat.
They were found responsible, right? They were found criminally responsible for much of what took place there. Is that right?
Not from much of what took place.
Some of what
but
took place.
For a very specific incident. There were Bosnian Muslims who had sought refuge on the UN base in Potocari, and they had put their name to this list, and initially it was reported as the list of 234, but the number went up to closer to 300. And what happened was when the army came to the base, they said, we want these men, and you have to turn them over to us. And Dutchbat did turn them over, despite this protest, and despite the knowledge that very likely their fate is going to be quite grim. And the Dutch court has recently convicted Dutchbat of responsibility for that, for those 300 men. And they're required to pay compensation to the families. But what the people who brought the case, the mothers of Srebrenica, what they say is, why did you make this dividing line? Why just the 300 men on the base? What about the thousands of men and boys on the other side of the base? Why don't they also have responsibility for that? And one of the things that I talk about in my book, in The Unquiet Dead, is this UN base in Srebrenica as a dividing line between life and death. If you were on the base, you were safe. If you were taken off the base, your future was certainly to be executed. 20
years later, how many of those responsible for what took place 20 years ago have been brought to justice?
Not nearly enough. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, in my opinion, has done tremendous work, very important work. There have been 161 indictments at the tribunal. They have completed most of the prosecutions. There's just a few cases left before the tribunal winds up its business. So in terms of strict numbers, obviously it's not enough because many people participated in that war. Many people were responsible for what took place at those concentration camps. The mass rape that took place in Bosnia, fewer than 40 men have been prosecuted or convicted for those rapes, which are estimated actually reported as 20,000, but estimated to be more than 40,000. So in the overall picture, it seems that justice hasn't been done. But if you look at who they've prosecuted, heads of state, heads of the army, civilian and political leaders, it has a tremendous impact. And what the tribunal has done, I think, has done away with this tradition of impunity for war crimes. So in that sense, their work is very significant, and it must continue.
Is the investigation active, and are they pursuing those responsible?
Well, they're actually coming to the end of their term, but they have General Ratko Mladic, the commander of the Bosnian Serb army, in custody. They have just completed the trial of the Bosnian Serb political leader Radovan Karadzic. So arguments on that trial closed in November, and the verdict should come out sometime this year. Probably it will take as long as a year. But if these two men are convicted of genocide, complicity in genocide, joint criminal enterprise, these two who are the architects of that war and of the genocide and the tremendous suffering for Bosnia's people, all groups, if they're convicted, I think that will send a very clear message that the suffering was not in vain and that you can't commit a genocide with impunity, that the international community will stand by its own principles of international law.
Those who survived the massacres, etc., any sense about where they all are now?
Well, some are still in the country itself.
They stayed, eh?
Some have, although not many have been repatriated to Srebrenica. And of course, there's a refugee population all over the world, including in Toronto, in many cities in the United States and in the Netherlands, and wherever countries have accepted a refugee population. But in many cases, and recently there was a story in the New York Times where the State Department is about to deport 150 Bosnian Serbs who had fled here, who had fled to the States and were living side by side with their victims and were known by their victims and were said that these people should go back. They should be indicted by the tribunal or by the national court system. Once the tribunal's work is done, the national courts can continue prosecuting war criminals. So that's starting to take place now. But it's a very, I think, uncomfortable and unfair situation when perpetrators and victims have to live together.
What impact do you think this will have on the future of peacekeeping? Because it certainly, I mean, the whole peacekeeping thing just fell apart, right? It was appalling.
It was the wrong mission from the start. There was a war taking place. There was no peace to
no
keep.
Peace to keep.
And there was no indication that there would be any peace or that, you know, the Greater Croatia or Greater Serbia project was serious about peace. So to put peacekeepers into that type of situation was the wrong call from the beginning. And in the 1999 report that the UN published on the fall of Srebrenica, it admits that roundly, that peacekeeping was the wrong choice to make. I think certainly in the lesson that's been learned is you don't put peacekeepers into a situation like that where there is no peace to keep. And the UN said that through error, misjudgment, and an inability to recognize the scope of the evil confronting us, we failed to do our part to save the people of Srebrenica from the Serb campaign of mass murder. We thought impartiality was the right course, and it clearly wasn't when there was an aggressor and a victim.
Since the war, How would you characterize the status of relations among the three peoples now, today? Muslims, Croats, Serbs in Bosnia.
Oh, that's an excellent question. I think from my reading of the situation is it's a very uneasy and fragile peace.
But it is a peace?
It is a peace, and it's a peace that's held. Although there have been little flare-ups here and there, there's been that same kind of hateful rhetoric. And there's now, with the reconstitution of the structure of the government in Bosnia, where the presidency rotates every 8 months through a Bosniak, a Serb, and a Croat, it's forced people into ethnic and religious categories when they might not necessarily have thought of themselves that way before. And I think as long as you have that culture of impunity, not at the tribunal, but on the ground, where there are perpetrators walking free, not having had to account for their crimes, that leads to a very unworkable and unstable situation where the same tensions can flare up at any time and the same country can be destabilized in the same way.
But for example, 25, 30 years ago, where people intermarried and everybody mixed together, is that allowed now, or is everybody sort of retreated to their respective corners and there's no intermingling?
I think there is still some intermingling. I think there are still people who hold true to that Bosnian ideal, but of course there's, in areas outside of the major cities, there is a great deal of tension. So for example, one of the things that I read recently is Bosnian Muslim survivors who go up to Srebrenica to visit the genocide memorial or to bury their dead. As they're going in the buses up that hillside, they're passing by Serb children who are making the Chetnik salute in their faces. We still hear stories about pigs being thrown into mosques or farmers finding their livestock slaughtered on their doorstep. So all of these very tense things are still happening, just not at that volume and not to that degree.
You know, of course, from the Serb point of view, I mean, I remember when I was there, people would say to me, you know, we know what they did to us in 1389 at Kosovo Polja, and we're, you know, it's payback time. I mean, if people have a 500-year-long memory of grievances, can you really hope for a more peaceful future?
Well, I think that was one of the tropes that was certainly circulated at the time and certainly exploited by the ultranationalist project of Slobodan Milosevic, that these people have been our civilizational enemies. We can never have peace with them. But again, I think that's a rhetoric that was exploited, and it's completely it flies in the face of the Bosnian history, which was this 600-year period of coexistence. Interruptions, of course, for the world wars, but we're in Europe where there are not these interruptions. And of people who had learned to live together peacefully, to respect each other's traditions, even to absorb them into their own. So I would meet Bosnian Muslims all the time who would say that they celebrate Christmas. So I think that it's a clever way of saying, well, if all sides are guilty, we don't have to act. But I never bought it for a second.
Have you been to Srebrenica?
I haven't, but I would like to go this year for the 20th anniversary.
So you will go in July for the 20th?
It's my hope to.
Your hope to?
Yes.
Why do you think it would be important for you to actually go and see it for yourself?
For a number of reasons. I'm a student of international law, so it's important to me to see how the norms of international law are carried out in practice. Here was a grave violation, a genocide that took place on our television screens, essentially, while I was a young woman and a student activist. So I feel that it would be a moment of completion for me to see my work come to some closure or some end. And then, of course, I'm a Muslim woman as well, so I was interested in the Bosnian War as a young Muslim woman, seeing what Muslim women over there were going through, and I had a personal connection and a sense of identity. And I have this belief that people of different faiths and different cultures can live together peacefully, that there's nothing in them intrinsically to divide them. It's what we make of those things. And I've lived that experience in Canada all my life, so I know it's certainly possible. But I would like to go and pay my respects. I would like to go and pray for the dead.
We are really glad that you found the time to be with us here today. The Unquiet Dead is your novel. Ausma Khan, thanks so much for visiting us at TVO.
Thank you so much for having me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.